Welcome, everyone. Good morning for those of you joining here in Geneva. I'm Renata Hesmandalacqua, and I work at UNIDIR, where I lead the Gender and Disarmament program. The topic of this session now is one that has come up before in the two previous discussions, so I'm glad we'll have a chance to delve into this. It's inclusivity in dialogue, and our objective is to explore main issues related to inclusivity in ICT-related dialogues and processes, considering the benefits as well as the challenges and difficulties we may face when trying to implement measures to achieve geographical, gender, and sectoral representation in multilateral processes. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists here today. So I'll start with the colleagues joining here in Geneva. We have Jean-Yves Hart, a senior director in charge of strategic partnerships at Microsoft. He's based in Geneva, Switzerland, and he manages the relationship between Microsoft and international organizations. We also have Dr. Serge Dro. He's a senior IT security expert and incident respondent at Proton Technologies. Serge holds a PhD in theoretical astrophysics and has worked in the private industry and academia in Switzerland and Canada. Joining us online, we have Dr. Catherine Guettau. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the ICT Authority, a state corporation under the Ministry of ICT in Kenya. We also have Orla Tunney, the Director for International Security Policy at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. Prior to that, Orla was ambassador to Portugal and Morocco. And we also have, joining us from China, Dr. Lu Chuanying. He's a senior fellow and director of Research Center for Cybersecurity Governance at Shanghai Institute for International Studies. So as I mentioned before, the topic of inclusivity has been highlighted by previous panelists, and I'd like to start with a broad question to kick off the debate. I'll start, we have people here joining us from different sectors, academia, government, and private sector, and I'm sure they must have different views on what inclusivity means, coming from either their professional background or geographical origin. So maybe I'll start with our colleague here, Jean-Yves. Jean-Yves, if you could tell us what does inclusivity mean to you, and how can it strengthen our dialogue on ICTs in international security?
Yes, thank you very much. First, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here. I'm very honored by the invitation extended by UNIDIR, and I would like to thank UNIDIR for inviting me in this conference. We have heard a lot, as you were saying, Renata, we have already heard a lot about inclusivity without necessarily defining what it is, although I would think that the definition should be more or less undisputed. From my perspective, inclusivity means really inviting to the table, inviting to a dialogue all the parties who are capable and committed to contributing to the solution of the question or the issue which is the object of the dialogue. So inviting all stakeholders that are capable and committed to that solution. In the field that we are talking about today, ICT and security, the obvious actors when we talk about inclusivity are also, of course, the governments, the industry, and especially the ICT industry, but not only the ICT industry, academia and civil society more generally. We see inclusivity at work in that space I have to say, outside of the United Nations discussions, we see inclusivity at work, in particular, for instance, in the Paris Call on trust and security in cyberspace. The call which was adopted 2 years ago. And at this stage where we are talking about the implementation of the 9 principles of the Paris Call, that's a place where we see really inclusivity at work. For instance, the company of which I'm part, Microsoft, is directly involved in the implementation of the 3rd principle of the Paris Call on security in the election process. Others, for instance, Kaspersky, a Swiss-based company, is directly involved in the discussion of principle number 6 on security in the supply chain. So this is a space, definitely ICT and security, where there is a possibility for inclusivity and where we see inclusivity at work, as I was mentioning, outside of the UN processes, but also in multilateral processes that involve governments as well as the civil society. And I think that it's interesting to see how it's working and whether there are learnings that can be taken from that experience in those outside of the UN and try to see whether it can be bring it into the UN processes. So, long response to your question about, but I thought that mentioning the example of the Paris Call, and which is a multi-stakeholder approach, of course, but in which a number of governments are involved, where we can see really the industry and civil society contributing to the implementation of those principles, could be a good start for to answer your question.
No, thank you very much. Yes, inclusivity has been mentioned before, and you defined it as bringing everyone to the table and perhaps most importantly involving them in implementation. But just to make sure that we go beyond like the buzzword, just keep saying inclusivity, but actually what does that mean in practice, right? So maybe I'll ask our colleague Catherine, who's joining from Kenya, from your perspective, what does inclusivity mean, and how can it strengthen ICT-related dialogues?
Thank you very much, Renata, and thank you to UNIDIR for including me in this conversation. I have 4 tests of inclusivity. The first one is that everyone knows enough to choose whether or not to participate in a dialogue. The second test, anyone who is interested in participating has an opportunity to participate. My third test, everyone's viewpoint and insights are respected. And my 4th test, everyone enjoys the benefits or the outcomes of a dialogue. So if we meet those 4 tests, then that is when I would define a process as being inclusive. I'll also mention that inclusivity is closely related with diversity, and we have to do what I call allow the uncomfortable to the table, the people who make us feel uncomfortable, because this brings new perspectives that challenge our favorite beliefs. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That's really interesting, Catherine, because you also, in addition to the process, you're talking about inclusivity in the results, right? Everyone should also be able to benefit from the results of the process. Going to our colleague in China, Chunyang, how does this resonate with you? What is your perspective on inclusivity and the benefits it brings to the dialogue?
First, I should say thank you for the moderator. Thank you for UNIDIR inviting me. And my answer goes to the because global governance
I'm sorry, Chuanyang, I think we're having connections problems. So maybe I'll ask Orla instead while we reconnect.
Thank you very much, Renata. Good morning, Excellencies and everybody. It's a very good question. And as you said there, sometimes we can repeat the word inclusion without really thinking about what it means. So in advance of this discussion, I thought what it really means to me is two things really, fairness and strength. An inclusive process will be a strong process and it will be a fair process. And inclusion is an active thing. We include people. It's a doing. It's not just something that happens by accident. So a process becomes inclusive if we actively include people. And I really liked what Catherine said there. Everyone knows enough to be able to participate. And I was reflecting, Ireland, as you may know, sponsored the multi-stakeholder, the intersessional multi-stakeholder event last December within the OEWG process. And I was reflecting on this. We feel that that was a very inclusive process, and our co-funding that demonstrated Ireland's commitment to inclusivity. But I was thinking exactly that. How did we communicate? There was an open call for participation. Was that communicated broadly enough? We actively communicated it within our own networks, as UN partners did, but we really have to think, hand in hand with inclusion comes transparency. And we have to make sure that the stakeholders know enough to know how to be included within the process. And I think specifically on the gender perspective, if I may, this is an area that Ireland has accorded a particular importance to. We're now in our third national action plan on the implementation of UNSCR 1325. And we really focus on the prioritization of gender equality and women's leadership and meaningful participation in processes to do with disarmament and security, and the integration of gender analyses into policy making, planning and implementation, and efforts to address the effects and the drivers of what I would call harmful masculinities and discriminatory gender norms. Ireland participates in a number of groupings that serve to advance mainstreaming gender inclusion. In 2019, Ireland was involved with partners.
Hello.
In the context of the UNGA First Committee on the Arms Trade Treaty, and we led a joint statement on gender and disarmament at the First Committee in 2019. And also within, as one of the co-chairs of the International Gender Champions Disarmament Impact Group there in Geneva. Ireland supported the UNIDIR publishing the Gender and Disarmament Resource Pack, and the second version of that was released this year. And let me take this opportunity to plug it, to promote it. There's some really good practical ideas in there, which I hope that today's discussions will, I hope that we can demonstrate the relevance of that and the benefit of mainstreaming them to make our processes stronger and fairer.
Thank you, Orla. I like how the responses are actually adding on into the debate on inclusivity and inclusion, bringing topics such as diversity, transparency, and gender equality. So Serge, you're here with us in Geneva. Could you tell us from your perspective, what does inclusivity mean, what it has meant in your work so far, and how do you see the benefits as well as the challenges of making a process inclusive?
Thank you very much. When I talk to my parents, they always strikes me that in many respects, not in all, but in many, their world was a much simpler one. It was clear who was doing what, and I think one of the big changes or disruption the internet brought is that this is no longer true. The internet brings together communities that before didn't really have much in common. You now don't have just a handful of neighbors, you have nearly 200 countries that are your neighbor in the internet, and that challenges things. It's also no longer states that just control the whole game, like in a fixed line phone network, for example. The infrastructure is owned by private companies, but the internet is also very much about the edge. It's about the people that use it, that provide the content, and interact. And this is going to become more dramatic as the next 3.5 billion people come online. They're not going to be kind of US or European middle-class people. They're going to be from all over the place. That means different kind of social classes, different cultures. So I think that is where we start facing the challenge of diversity. When we look at how do we perceive challenges, there was a recent study that compared attacks to kind of like what we perceive around the infrastructure, big companies, states, and compared the information available there to the information about attacks on civil society. And what was found is that they don't overlap or hardly overlap, which means we only see half the picture, because the attacks on civil society, on poor people, on emerging countries and economies, they just never make the glossy paper reports. So that for me is the big challenge. So inclusivity for me means that really all the affected people are around the table, and that all the challenges have an equal weight. And I kind of like Catherine's 4 checks, but I challenge her on the first one. I think we also need to have the people around the table who don't even know that they have a problem and an issue. So I don't really know how to achieve this. I hope to gain some clarity today, but that's what I feel. Thanks.
No, that's really interesting, Serge. I think that goes also to democratization of knowledge and all this debate that we also face. Catherine, you had your 4 checks. I'm sure I assume they come from your experience participating in multi-stakeholder processes. Could you elaborate, perhaps, providing some concrete examples of best practices or lessons that you have observed in the past that have worked and actually made the process more inclusive?
Thank you very much, Renata. It was a bit of a challenging question, because I've had quite a wide experience in my life, starting in academia and then going into the African diplomatic community and then government, and now being in UN processes. And all of us are challenged to include as many people. Indeed, my constitution in Kenya requires it. But it's always very challenging, because there's a tension between inclusivity and progress. I think there's the now famous African proverb that if you want to go fast, walk alone. If you want to go far, walk together. So there's so many times when we want to walk fast and we want to achieve quickly, and we know that the more people, the more diversity of views we bring in, the harder it's going to be to reach our goal quickly. However, maybe the example I can give is the United Nations group of governmental experts, because that is the one I participated in for the last 3 sessions. Initially, I think it was a dialogue between the advanced countries in the world. It was a group of 15 countries. In 2014-15, they decided to include a few developing countries. And I must say, through the kind chairmanship of Brazil, they were very kind to us because we were very ignorant about many of the issues that were being raised. Many of us had never participated in international multi-stakeholder. So they had to show patience. There had to be a lot of capacity building even within the process to enable us to participate effectively. Then in the next session, which was the 2016-17 session, there was a group of 11 countries during the third session, I believe it was, who came together and said, I think this has to move beyond now the 20 countries that are sitting at this table, and other countries need to participate. And this is what eventually resulted in the development of the open-ended working group, which I think some of my colleagues here have mentioned, has been a useful process and which has allowed many people who traditionally would not be in a governmental process such as the UNGGE to have their voice heard and to bring new perspectives into this process. So I'd just like to say that maybe some people see a tension between the UNGG and the open-ended working group, but I view them as complementary. It's important to have the process that includes everybody who is interested in participating, but it is also important to have the process that consists of experts and allows some structure and some clarity of outcome. So I don't know how it will all end because this is the first time we've had both a UNGG and an open-ended working group. But in my view, I see it as a very positive development and as a methodology that could be considered more and more going into the future.
That's really interesting. So from your answer, I get that patience and also formal structures for capacity building are necessary to allow for an inclusive dialogue which takes into account participants with different levels of knowledge, different sets of practical experience. I see that our panelist from China is connected again. So Chen Yung, if you could talk a little bit more about your perspective on inclusivity. You have a background in academia, you work at a think tank. How do you see the strengths of a multi-stakeholder process, but also a 1.5, 2 track approach to multilateral, to diplomacy on ICTs?
Connectivity previously. So my answer to your previous question is the inclusivity means that we have different actors, not just traditionally global governance related to the state, private sector, and civil society. We have a lot of the different actors with different identities. Their voice should be heard. So they should be get into this process. Another dimension of the inclusivity, it means that the different topics, because we have different concerns of different actors. So a lot of the topics should be get into this process. And go back to your second question, because we have worked together with our colleagues from the United States and Russia, we launched a couple of the track 1.5 or track 2 dialogue in the past 5 years. For example, we have the IMCS, which is the Roundtable on Military Cyber Stability. So we in this process, we try to bring together the leading academics, thoughtful leaders, and practitioners from different countries, and we try to apply their expertise, experience, and perspectives to do the research to develop our interdisciplinary and cross-cultural analytic framework, which will help people to better understand the cyber stability issues. And Also, we organized a couple of the conference in the US, in China, and I think during our dialogue, and we also have some research programs focused on some specific issues. And all this result, I think it's very helpful for the government, for the track one dialogue between government to government, because as I previously said, that we have so much actors over there, we have so much topics, and cybersecurity is so new and challenge is so high. So we have to have this different background people and use their different knowledges, and to also the historical lessons we learned, and we put all together to establish our analytic framework, which I think that can to do the better analysis of the cybersecurity related issues, and also it's a great help for the government to know the issues and to know the different perspective behind the cybersecurity issues. And also, I believe that it will be also helpful for the government to establish the confidence buildings and also the trust and transparencies. That is what we are doing in the past 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've been discussing different formats of bringing various stakeholders together, so such as a 1.5 or track 2 conference, a GGE, an open-ended working group. And we are all saying about the benefits that they bring. But as Catherine said, there are some difficulties as well. If you bring more people, you may have to walk slower, but you may reach a further destination. So if we could address a little bit of the challenges and what type of preparation is needed to ensure good and inclusive dialogue. I would like to go to our colleague here, Genevieve. Could you tell from your experience a little bit what you think are the challenges and how to ensure that a dialogue is inclusive and we address those challenges?
Sure. I mean, I could certainly tell you what are the benefits of inclusivity, having gone through that. Challenges as well. I mean, and to some extent we have already, and previous speakers have already alluded to some of the challenges of inclusivity. For me, and the challenges of inclusivity in this process are to some extent similar to those that you find in inclusivity in other processes, especially in, for instance, peace-building processes. And it's mainly, from my perspective, who is invited, so who are the actors that come to the table, when they are brought to the table, when they can participate, to what end they can participate, and finally how they participate. These are really 4 questions that, for me, reveal the kind of challenges that the organizers of multilateral negotiations need to address when they consider inclusivity. Who are the actors that are brought to the table? And I heard Catherine give a number of criteria, as others today have also given a number of criteria. I think all those make a lot of sense, but they show that it's something which is not easy to identify the actors that need to come to the table. We heard also this morning talk about bringing not only in the IT sector, not only the large IT companies, but also talking about other IT companies. And I would say not only about the IT industry, but also talking about the other industries. If you look at what's going on and the other efforts that are done in cybersecurity, I was talking about the Paris Call, but you can also include a Charter of Trust, where you see a number of industries being represented in a multi-stakeholder effort to improve cybersecurity. So that's for the who. Who can you bring to the table? And that's something which really needs to be thought through. Same thing for when you bring people to the table, at what stage in the negotiation. I think that one of the main benefits of inclusivity, at least from an IT industry perspective, is that we in the IT industry, look, the infrastructure on which cyber attacks are taking place. This infrastructure is mainly owned by the IT industry. We own the data centers to a large extent. We own data centers, the servers, the routers, the fiber optic cables through which those attacks are taking place. And therefore, we see what is taking place on our networks. And for me, that is something which is very important when you talk about defining norms, principles, or rules on cybersecurity, because it is all that information which the IT industry can disclose and can provide, because that's what we see. All that information is the background to the development of the rules. And not only to the development of the rules, but also to an understanding of what is possible with the rules. What is it that can be done? I was talking earlier about this inclusivity and the multi-stakeholder approach in the implementation of the Paris Core principles. I mean, the benefit of having the industry participate at some point in the negotiation of the norms, the rules, and the principle is that we can tell you not only what we see, but also how we can act to prevent, to stop the attacks, and to recover from those attacks. And I think that these are also important points in this inclusive process. So for me, you were asking about the challenges. It's who, when, and to what end. To what end do you invite the non-state actors to the table?
Thank you. When I think about challenges, I think about very practical things we see when organizing a conference, right? Sitting down, looking at the program, you want to make sure all sectors are represented. You want to make sure you have gender balance, geographical balance, and that takes some preparation. It cannot be a last-minute afterthought. Because as Orla was saying, inclusion just does, it's an action. It doesn't happen on its own. But Serge, I saw you nodding at something that Jean-Yves was saying. Would you like to share your perspectives on the benefits as well as the challenges of inclusivity?
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, traditionally, especially the security stuff has always been top-down. It's a state's responsibility to keep its citizens safe. But that fails in the internet context. And I give you two examples. One is there was a recent discovery in Switzerland that all this Bitcoin fraud is actually a big thing and not just a couple of people who lost some money. And it was the sum of all this little money that make this a big issue. You don't see this from the top down. Another example is if you lack a cultural context in which something is happening, you can't anticipate what's going to come. And I think this is something that especially the internet industry is a little bit guilty of. We export our technology across the world without actually understanding the cultural context in which it's going to be used. And that is what makes all of this very, very difficult. I think states have learned that they need to talk to the big tech companies, but it's kind of stopped there. My background is incident response, and incident response means we have teams of security experts that have long ago realized we can't do this solo. So the working alone thing in security doesn't work. We've also figured out that maybe if the group is too big, it gets too slow. So you have to find a middle ground, and this middle ground is what I nowadays call a network governance approach, where we actually start working together on a need-to-know basis, on point-to-point projects. We're not always around everyone. We're not always around all together at the same table, because that would need an awfully big table. But we have a table where we can sit around when it's needed. And I think it needs to be an approach where we start working together, where we also start understanding that we only have part of the picture. In technology today, no one controls the entire stack of services anymore. Not even big companies such as Microsoft or Google do so. They all depend on other people. So we have to start learning that we need to be open to other views that we couldn't conceive. And that's not always comfortable. Catherine at the beginning was saying we need to have the opinions around the table that make us feel uncomfortable, and I totally agree. There's going to be views that we just don't understand and have to learn. But without having that, I don't think we're going to make progress.
Thank you. It seems like there is some sort of consensus that inclusivity is a good thing and we should strive to achieve it. I think the difficulty is in how, right? Finding the right process, the right way. So I'd like to go to Orla in Ireland. If you could share perhaps some concrete examples or lessons you've observed from past processes that could give us some insights on the best way, on how to implement and achieve inclusivity.
Thank you very much, Renata. And before I do that, I'd like to just respond to what Jean-Yves said, and it put me in mind of something I read once about the history of the naval service, that in the days of sailing ships, that sometimes commanders were put in control of ships who didn't understand the operation of the basic physics of sailing a vessel and the limitations of the wind and so on. So these commanders would attempt to board these ships and order the crew to sail into the wind and so on, something which was physically impossible. So I completely take his point that when we talk about inclusion, of course, in the cyber domain, when it is the companies that develop the technology and run the systems, of course, we have to include them as well, because otherwise we as diplomats or whatever other role we play within the process, the danger is that we come up with what we think is a wonderful idea, which technically is not possible. So I just wanted to respond to that because I think it's a very fair point. And again, at the risk of having an Ireland and Kenya love in, I'm agreeing with everything that Catherine says, and I also, thinking of inclusivity, I think of a process that Ireland and Kenya co-chaired at the UN, which was the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was a good example of an incrementally built stakeholder dialogue, which really involved civil society. But one could argue, of course, that in the development sphere, it's much easier and much more instinctive to be open to civil society. In the security area or the disarmament area, it's perhaps less instinctive to think of bringing in civil society. And part of what we can do in attempting to, one thing I want to say, leadership still exists even when inclusivity is present. So yes, we want to be open, we want to include, we want to invite people in, but that does not mean that leadership is not still required. And for just a simple example, if you have a platform, you can promote inclusivity by, for example, developing a paper which highlights an aspect that hasn't been thought of before. And if, for example, you develop a working paper on a particular theme, particular angle, then that will draw the attention of people who are interested in that theme. And that will lead to them gathering around your process. So those of us who may find ourselves inside the room, we also have a responsibility to internalize as best we can the interests of groups who may be excluded, and to invest in capacity building, to invest our time and resources in the preparation of papers to feed into the process, which helps everyone to understand how important it is to include. And I know there are dangers in slowing down a process, but a greater danger is to develop a set of norms or a regulatory system which doesn't reflect the needs of everybody. Again, to think of a simple image, we've all seen somebody is building a machine, and that comedy horror moment when you realize that you've assembled the machine and you look at the workbench and there are some pieces still there. And the real risk is that we build a machine which has some parts missing. And coming back to strength in inclusivity, if you leave some parts out, the machine won't work properly. But yeah, just to reiterate that those of us who are inside the tent now have to play our part to develop the concepts. And for example, in another area of disarmament, Ireland submits papers, for example, the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons every year in the review of the NPT. Ireland highlights the gender dimension within the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as well. A lot of people maybe weren't alive to the reality that there are different gendered impacts from nuclear weapons. So until you air those concepts, then it can be difficult to build a structure that responds to those realities. As regards processes that worked well, I think the Arms Trade Treaty was negotiated in a very cooperative spirit with civil society and with organizations like the ICRC. And coming back to the theme that I'm maybe focusing on today, that includes specific provisions on gender-based violence. But I don't want to keep talking about cyber in the negative sense in terms of gender. I mean, there are risks and vulnerabilities which apply unevenly across the gender spectrum, but also in terms of opening up the positives and responding to the needs. So one thing that struck me when I was in New York for our intersessional stakeholder meeting was we were all listening very attentively to the academics and the industry representatives and the NGOs who were in the room and taking notes and congratulating ourselves a little bit. This is great, it's multi-stakeholder, we're hearing all these points of view. But then one of the stakeholders took the floor and he said, why are all the member states being silent? When are we going to hear your view? And that was just a little check to realize that inclusivity doesn't just mean bringing people in and listening to them. It means allowing them to listen to us as well, to be inside the room, and not just to sit there passively, but to share with them. Within a large format like that, of course, it's very difficult for everyone to speak, but to have a more open communication strategy, to use different channels to communicate with different stakeholders. So it's not just a matter of come in now and we listen to you and then go away again and we'll go back inside our sealed box. To have more transparency of the work that we're doing, and I think communication has to be central. And it's apt that we're talking about this in the cyber context because, of course, we have so many channels of communication open to us through ICTs, and we need to be a little bit more creative about how we use those so that people know what's going on.
This example you brought, Arla, from when you're in a UN conference in New York and you have the civil society bringing their perspectives and hoping to be in a dialogue with member states and listening back. This is something that we should be paying attention now that physical meetings are not happening anymore. What are the channels, like the side events or the coffee at the Vienna Cafe that civil society are having now to be able to shape and inform policy processes? So I think this requires from everyone a kind of awareness of that we need to find new ways of bringing this perspective that we were kind of used to having as inside events and in informal chats in the conference venues. So just to continue this very interesting conversation about the meaning of inclusivity and how we can achieve them, I found I have a slide that I wanted to present. Let's see if we can see. Just to bring an analogy and see a little bit of a provocation, see what your thoughts are. Yes, so this is something I saw on Twitter, is that someone posted, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, equity is being on the planning team. So I don't know if this applies to us. It's an analogy with a party, but maybe we could think about something related to a conference. Diversity is being invited to attend, inclusion is being asked to speak, equity is being on the planning team behind the conference. So I just wanted to get a little bit of your thoughts on these dimensions, if you think they are relevant or not. And how can we should we start also going beyond the conversation on inclusivity to actually address equality, equity, or is this something that it doesn't apply for the field of ICTs and international security? If I go back to, I think, our panelist in China, Chunyang, could you react to these thoughts?
Yeah, I think that they reflect some of the meaning of these different vocabularies, and but if people study cyberspace governance for a long time, we have the discussing about the terminology for a long time. For example, like what is multi-stakeholder, what it means to the cyberspace, and what is multilateral approach, and what is the multi-parties, which the Chinese government emphasize. So, I mean, it's all shared some content, but also have the different part. So my general impression is we should not go too deep to the difference, to emphasize the difference of the terminology, rather than emphasize what the consensus we can make to this new term. Inclusivity, at least to me, the new term. And the purpose for this term is, I think it should to get rid of the previous dispute on the multi-stakeholder, multilateral, or multi-party. And I think that is the most important thing for me. And second thing, I think that is important is when we discuss, as I said, there are a lot of the different topics. But when we discuss the cyber stability issues, I think that it's more focused on the military and more focused on the intelligence, at least my personal perspectives. So in these very hardcore issues, and it's, I mean, that the state as the leading actors should take more responsibilities to protect the peace and development of the society. But also, as the leading actor, you should, pay respect to all the relative actors, because the stability is not military and intelligence is important, but not just the all concerns should be taken into the process. So I think there's the very subtle balance over here. It's an art. It's not a simple approach. You know how to do it. You need a lot of experience, and you need to be very balanced, the different actors concerning. So I think that that's my thinking of this inclusivity, this terminology.
It is definitely a tricky balance. Catherine, do you have any notes on this, on the relationship between diversion, inclusion, and equality? Is this something that we should start considering also in the ICT dialogues?
Thank you so much. It's lovely to see something thought-provoking from Twitter, so thank you for that, Renata. I found a lot of resonance with Janelle Aldred's quote. And if I start with equity as being part of the planning team, I think this is one of the areas where, as coming from a developing country, we rarely set the agenda. We are invited into agendas which have been prioritized, organized, and funded by others. So in a way, it's nice that you're being invited to the party because people believe that you're part of the answer. But obviously you have a limited span of control because often you have not chosen the agenda. You have not organized how it is going to be handled. And usually sometimes we're reminded also that we're not the ones funding it. And of course, we know the saying, he who pays the piper, or she who pays the piper, calls the tune. So I think this is something we need to reflect on. And perhaps as the developing world, we should be asserting ourselves more in these areas by sometimes setting the agenda and inviting others to our party, which is organized to either celebrate or otherwise our concerns and priorities. So yes, I can see that this was a very thought-provoking quotation that will help us rethink or broaden my 4 tests of inclusivity to include a 5th test, who organized the party.
Thank you, Catherine. I see Jean-Yves is taking a lot of notes. Do you want to share your thoughts with us on this?
Yeah, well, thank you. I thought that this distinction between diversity, inclusivity, equity is interesting. And the reason why I find it interesting, because it goes to a point which I wanted to make and to be very clear, coming from the industry. I think that an important element of this debate on inclusivity relates to the roles and responsibilities of the different actors in an inclusive process. So what are the roles and the responsibilities of the industry, of civil society in those, and of course governments, in those discussions on ICT and security? And the one thing which, from my perspective, is absolutely clear is that the decisions about the contents of those norms, of those principles, of those rules, that decision is made by the governments. It's made by the states. And the industry is not claiming, at least I don't think we are claiming, a participation in the decision-making process. From my perspective, where the industry is coming is to provide the information, provide, as I was mentioning before, the background on which those discussions and then the decisions are being made. So for me, that goes to the point I was making before, which is to what end do you include other parties? What is their role and what are the responsibilities in the negotiation that are taking place? And I think it must be made very clear that there is a distinction between participating in a decision-making process, which is the role of governments, and then coming to the negotiation in order to provide information so that the rules are properly defined and we know where we're going. And I would add also something which I think Orla has said and which I find very important. In a space such as the one which we are talking about, ICT and security, where, as I was mentioning, all the attacks are taking place on an infrastructure which is owned by the industry, it is important also for the industry to understand where the rules are coming from, to understand the background, to understand what it is that the governments are trying to achieve. So it is this bilateral discussion which is taking place. But again, I found the distinction between diversity, inclusivity, and equity very interesting because it goes to that point, which are the roles and the responsibilities of the various parties in an inclusive negotiation process. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to make that point.
Yes, I'm sure we all understand that different actors have different responsibilities and they come from with different backgrounds and knowledge also. And it's a balance. I see one person from the audience wrote here to us that it's a tricky balance of how to set the agenda and keep the process widely bottom up while also ensuring some strategic purpose. I think this came from Marc Carvel. And I think this is actually at the heart of the issue. So I'd like to move to our last round of questions. Thinking about modes of engagement, if we would like to think what has brought most benefits and what is actually more needed, some sort of like formal modes of engagement or more flexible arrangements. How do you see the benefits and the pros and cons of having a very structured formal process versus a more informal venue, informal interaction? I would like to start with Serge.
Well, to be honest, I think we need both. It's when you start tackling a new problem, you don't really have clarity, everything seems nebulous or everything seems super simple, which is about even worse. So that's good when you have a process that's kind of open, where people can bring in ideas. We call this typically brainstorming, but at the end of the day, when you have to bring things to a conclusion, it probably helps to be a little more structured so you don't get lost in this process. And I think coming back to the quote, having the people on the organizing committee, that is where things become tricky, because as soon as you start having structure, the question is, whose structure are you going to have? Is it the way of thinking that I've been trained as a scientist originally, and a very logical thinking, and to which others may argue, well, there's much more than just logic and technology to human beings, and all of this technology stuff at the end of the day is used by humans, so it is about human beings, it's about our citizens, the people that live here. And that's going to be the challenge. So I think we need both, and in the formal processes we need a certain openness to have maybe consider 2 or 3 different ways of formality.
Thank you. Orla, what are your thoughts on this, on the pros and cons of having like formal structured processes versus more flexible arrangements for allowing for inclusion?
Thank you. I suppose if you'd asked me last year, I would have argued more in favor of a need for formality, because the danger is that if you don't have a requirement written down that you can check against, or an action plan and say, yes, we implemented that, then the danger is it just doesn't happen. Everyone says, oh, yeah, that's great. But of course, in these COVID times, I think it has to be all about flexibility, because all the plans that we had for this year, none of it would have involved me participating in this discussion in Geneva from my kitchen in Dublin. You know, if anything has demonstrated the need to be responsive and flexible, well, COVID has. And we have to make sure that the structures that we have set up don't fall victim. As you said, you know, the side chats that happen at in-person meetings are so valuable. The contacts, oh, you should call, or have you seen, or can you speak to? So we have to find new ways, definitely. I think this year, 2020, is the year of flexibility for sure. And I really like what Serge just said there as well about diversity of thought. Yes, I 100% agree with that. And I think that is also another element that touches on what Jean-Yves said about the perspective of industry. The people who understand and who are driven to provide an excellent service or do things in the most logical way versus the perspective of the users. And the danger is in these isolated times that we continue on. Those of us who have logical thought processes can say, well, it'll be logical to go ahead and do this. But then meanwhile, the voices of the users and those who are outside the tent can be left out. So we need to find new ways to bring people in. And on this platform, when we have so many technical experts, I'm confident that it's not beyond our ability to find new ways to communicate, to seek views. And as leaders within the process, we also have to look at how we can engage maybe on a smaller scale with our own stakeholders so that we can internalize the concerns of those who are outside the process, and we can use our voice to amplify their concerns. And yeah, just to respond, every day is full of surprises. So let's stay flexible with the help of communications technology.
Yes, that sounds very appropriate to our time. So we are actually coming to a close of this session. I just wanted to give the opportunity for the panelists. If anyone wants to say something, you can raise your hand or ask a question to each other. No final words. So I'd just like to thank you, everyone, and ask you to join me in a round of applause to our panelists. Yes, this was a really interesting conversation, and I hope we find venues to continue having it. Thank you very much.